So good morning again. Bonjour tout le monde. I was asked to say a few words to open this event today. My name is Rüdiger Sesemann. I'm the spokesperson of the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, and under the umbrella of the cluster, Dr. Christine Vogt-William convened this event today. And yeah, what can I say? I think it is a really exceptional event. I was expecting our invitees to be already on the podium so that you can see them, but you will see them in a moment. And if you see them, I think you will realize that their presence speaks for itself. I cannot claim to have attended so many Afro-feminist or decolonial feminist events, but I still dare to say that this group has never come together. We have four actually scholarly giants whom you will see in a moment and hear in a moment, and I really don't want to take away a lot of time, but I want to say this. The most senior of them, Dr. Fatou Sow, will officially receive the honorary doctorate from the University of Bayreuth tonight, the Big Sus honorary doctorate. And this is the occasion on which Dr. Vogt-William convened this round table. And when Fatou Sow was a student at the University of Dakar, I was an infant in the 1960s in Germany. And one of my sons recently, one of my young sons recently pulled out a very old photo album with pictures in black and white. And he said, "Dad, I'm really glad that I'm not born in the 60s because the world was still black and white." And this is for me more than an anecdote, because it also highlights how we see the world. And what I find particularly inspiring about the scholarship that our distinguished guests are doing, as well as the scholarship Dr. Vogt-William is doing, that it opens up new perspectives on how we see the world. I sometimes feel what I see is 2D through my, how should I say, conventional lenses that I use in my work, and you cannot actually see clearly a 3D movie unless you wear 3D viewing glasses. And I believe that these feminist women's studies, intersectional perspectives help us to see a 3D movie with 3D viewing glasses. And this is why I tremendously appreciate and respect and value the work you are doing. And I will leave it at that. And I would like to ask the audience to welcome our guests with a huge applause and hand over the mic. To Professor Andrea Behrens, the Big Sus spokesperson and Vice Dean of Early Career and Equal Opportunity in the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As Rüdiger already announced me, let me just say that this round table is also of highest relevance for a socially just higher education landscape. It is also of importance for the concerns and the joy for our young scholars themselves and for the legacies that they are crafting for young people of future generations. I should also say that this conversation today is an overview of the agenda and the commitments of our cluster Africa Multiple, and its commitment to the reconfiguration of African studies that Rüdiger Sesemann has also mentioned. Before I hand over to Christine Vogt-William, let me just introduce also our dear host and organizer and convener of this roundtable. Dr. Vogt-William is a scholar in literary and cultural studies. Her untiring work focuses on post-colonial and gender studies, which she has taught at several universities in Germany, in Berlin, Frankfurt, Münster, Freiburg, Augsburg, and recently together with me also in Bayreuth and together with other professors. She holds the position, the important position, of the director of the cluster's Gender and Diversity Office, and I personally admire how she is invested in finding ways of combining her exciting and innovative work with the scholarship that she has built up, and which also, I should say, lies at the heart of the cluster's work of reconfiguring African studies. With this, I'm happy to pass the word to my dear colleague and friend, Dr. Christine Vogt-William. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for those very kind words, Professor Sesemann, our cluster dean. Thank you very much also to the Vice Dean of Early Career and Equal Opportunity and the spokesperson of Big SAS, Professor Andrea Behrens, for these kind words and for actually being here. We all know if you want to have good things, you got to be there for good things. So I'm very, very glad to welcome you to this event. I hope you all have something to eat and drink and you're comfortable in your seats. Indeed, yes, we aim to cater for all our needs here, right? This is an academic pre-event to tonight's conferral of the Big SAS Honorary Doctorate on Professor Fatou Sow, which will take place on campus at the University of Bayreuth, and I hope to see many of you there this evening. The roundtable itself will engage with decolonial feminisms from francophone and anglophone African feminist perspectives with a view to generating valuable insights in intersectional and decolonial epistemic frames pertinent to the cluster's agenda of reconfiguring African studies. This intergenerational transdisciplinary conversation has been envisioned as a sharing of thought impulses from the speakers' diverse situated standpoints of their positionalities, their work, their disciplines. It is to be hoped that these African feminist and scholarly engagements will contribute to significant impulses to drive forward the cluster's agenda of reconfiguring African studies. Now, at this point, I would like to ask our speakers, to please come to your seats on the table, around the table. And my dears, we have African feminist giant scholars in the house, in the house. Okay, I'm hoping that the mic is on. The mic is on, yes, thank you so much. I'd like to thank our technicians in the back. They've been very kind to wire us up, making us fit for the 21st century. Thank you so much. Right, okay. I will begin by introducing our speakers. You will have the opportunity to listen to a few of their, shall we say, achievements in basically setting up this field. I'd like to begin with theoretical linguist Husseina Alidou. She is professor at the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literatures and the graduate program in comparative literature. She traveled to the US from Niger in 1988 to continue her education, going on to receive her doctorate in theoretical linguistics from Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Alidou has published widely on women's orality and literacy practices in African Muslim societies, African Muslim women's agency and gender justice, African women's literatures, gender discourses of identity and the politics of cultural production in African Muslim societies. Husseina Alidou has been a member of the African Studies Association since 1994. She has also held previous appointments and services that include the chair of all African Studies programs, USA 2009 to 2011, director of the Center of African Studies at Rutgers University 2009 to spring 2015. She's the current president of the African Studies Association from 2021 to 2022. And she is currently faculty director at the Center for Women's Global Leadership. From 2021, right? Okay, till now, that's right. She taught at several American universities, including the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the Ohio University, Cleveland State University. She was a visiting professor at the University of Hamburg in Germany, the University of Lüneburg in Germany, a visiting professor at the Université Abdou Moumouni in the Republic of Niger. She's won several awards for her scholarship and service, amongst them the Obafemi Awolowo Center for Gender and Social Policy Studies. She received the Distinguished Visiting Scholar Service Award in 2015, the Carnegie African Diaspora Fellowship Award in 2015, and the Newark Women in the Media Distinguished Community Service Award 2015. Our next speaker is Professor Adumako Ampofo. She's Professor of African and Gender Studies at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana in Accra. Considering herself an activist scholar, Akusua's areas of interest include African knowledge systems, higher education, race and identity politics, gender relations, masculinities, and popular culture. In her current work on Black masculinities, she explores the shifting nature of identities among young men in Africa and the diaspora. Another project, an archive of activism, gender, and public history in post-colonial Ghana, seeks to constitute a publicly accessible archive of and documentary on gender activism and political women in post-colonial Ghana. She's doing this with Kate Skinner from the University of Birmingham, funded by the British Academy. Currently, the documentary When Women Speak was premiered in January 2022. Adumako Ampofo is editor-in-chief of the Contemporary Journal of African Studies and the co-editor of Critical Investigations into Humanitarianism in Africa blog. She serves on a number of boards in several organizations, including the US African Studies Association, the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria, Africa Multiple Cluster Excellence, University of Bayreuth, Perivoli Africa Research Center at the University of Bristol, the Institute for Humanities in Africa, HUMA, University of Cape Town. Among the various appointments she has held, Akosua, Foundation Director at the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy at the University of Ghana, and the immediate past president of the African Studies Association of Africa. She's an honorary professor at the Center for African Studies at the University of Birmingham. She's also a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Amongst the various awards she has received, I mention Junior Fulbright Scholar, a New Century Fulbright Scholar, and a Senior Fulbright Scholar in Residence. So she's a Fulbright favorite. Yeah. In 2010, she was awarded the Feminist Activism Award by Sociologists for Women and Society. Françoise Vergès is an anti-racist, an anti-capitalist, decolonial feminist who was born in Paris but thinks of herself as someone from La Réunion Island and Algeria. Vergès centers her work on post-colonial studies and decolonial feminism. She has published extensively in French and English on themes ranging from post-colonial theory, creolization, psychoanalysis, the racial Anthropocene, slavery and colonial memorials, museums, and feminism, the economy of predation to Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire. Vergès first studied to become a journalist. After having worked as a journalist and editor in the women's liberation movement in France, she moved to the US in 1983 and received her bachelor degree in political science and women's studies with summa cum laude from the University of California in San Diego, in a PhD in political sciences from Berkeley University in 1995. She has taught at Sussex University and Goldsmiths College in England. Françoise Vergès has written over 10 books and produced 2 films on Aimé Césaire and Maryse Condé. and she's an independent curator who has notably organized exhibitions at the Louvre, regularly collaborating with artists. She's the co-founder and president of the collective Decolonize the Arts and of the free and open university Decolonizing the Arts. Between 2014 and 2019, she was curator of L'Atelier, a regular workshop on collective art and performance for artists and scholars. Vergès became a member of the Committee for the Remembrance and History of Slavery in 2004. I have the French title here, but I'm not going to bother you or torture you with my bad French. And she was also the president of this committee from 2009 to 2012. Between 2003 and 2010, she had developed the scholarly and cultural program for a museum for the 21st century on the island of La Réunion. She is also a member of several institutions working to prevent discrimination and racism. She sits on the board of the Galerie Béton Salon, pardon my French, please, and on the scientific council of the Fondation Liliane Thuram, again, pardon. Vergès was also chairholder of the Global South Chair at the Collège d'Études Mondiales from 2014 to 2018. In 2019, French publishers La Fabrique Édition brought out her most recent book, Un féminisme décolonial, please pardon the French, which was translated by Vergès and Ashley J. Bora in English in 2021 as A Decolonial Feminism. And for this, she received the English Pen Translates Award. This year, Pluto Press is publishing Françoise Vergès' new work, A Feminist Theory of Violence. Now, last but not least, I always save the best for last. I like doing that. We have Fatou Sow, born in Dakar in 1941, Senegalese feminist sociologist Fatou Sow. She's renowned as one of the first of a generation of African women researchers who, after independence, gave voice to African women and their issues. Dr. Sow received her baccalaureate in sociology from the Université de Dakar and completed a doctorate in sociology at the Université Paris-Sorbonne. She did her research director habilitation from the Université Paris Diderot. Dr. Sow was attached as a researcher to the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, CNRS, in Paris, excuse the French once more, while based at the Université de Dakar for 30 years. Her long-standing career has involved teaching, lecturing, and other engagements in Africa, Europe, and North America. Together with Aisha Imam and Amina Mama, she set up the Gender Institute at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, also known as CADESRIA, for which she has also been a trainer. Among her various appointments, she has acted as president of the Reproductive Health Research Network in Francophone Africa from 1992 to 1996, as coordinator for Francophone Africa of the Network Development with Women for a New Era, DAWN, 1995 to 2007, and she's currently a member of the board of trustees there. As an international coordinator for the Feminist Transnational Solidarity Network, Women Living Under Muslim Laws, WLUML, from 2008 to 2018. She's also a member of the Scientific Committee of CADESRIA. She's published extensively on the importance of feminist scholarship and African social sciences, secularism in sub-Saharan states, Francophone feminist research, religion, gender, and fundamentalism. Her research interests and activism have always centered on the rights and equality of women. In honor of this impressive trajectory, Dr. Sow is the second recipient of the Big Sass Honorary Doctorate from the University of Bayreuth after the Kenyan writer and academic Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o in 2014. So with that, you have an idea of the immense amount of wisdom that is sitting on that stage. Between them, about 120 years of insightful scholarship. Can I please hear it again for them in the house? Okay, now let's get to the business at hand. Before we start the conversation, I want to give, or rather chart, a few significant aspects of decolonial feminist scholarship that are pertinent to our conversation today. While we would all doubtless agree that this roundtable is relevant for our current times, The substance of decolonial feminism has been the subject of discussion since the 2000s, if not earlier. Indeed, Ugandan feminist legal scholar Sylvia Tamale has observed from the 1980s, interventions by African feminists challenging knowledge production and pedagogy within universities were the inaugural decolonial projects on the continent. An example of such an intervention that sprang from such decolonial efforts is that by Fatou Sow, Aisha Imam, and Amina Mama, when they organized the first Cadestria feminist colloquium on gender analysis in 1991. The proceedings of which were published as the seminal Gender Studies volume, Engendering African Social Sciences, published in 1997. This collective of feminist scholars who published this seminal volume have basically set gender studies at the core of this enterprise. And I need to extend my personal thanks to Fatou here for being part of that group of African feminist visionaries. In your own 1997 contribution on the social sciences in Africa and gender analysis, you list some of the inaugural decolonial projects on the continent. Yeah, you speak of a good 20 years of specifically African thought by organizations of women, students, and activists. WIN, AWARD, CAMS, SIAF, and WLUML, to cite just a few. And yet you point out, in universities and African research institutions, we must still defend the legitimacy of a gender approach as a category for understanding and explaining social and other approaches that accentuate class, race, or caste interests, political, economic, or cultural factors. In Africa itself, the contemporary debate about women is many-sided. The terms and concepts used, the stakes disputed, and the objectives sought take on new forms and expressions that vary with the era, context, cultural atmosphere, and interests at work. And indeed, that the defense of the legitimacy of gender studies in universities is still necessary today in the 21st century is one that bears some scrutiny, where one does wonder the level of hostility demonstrated when you think about our efforts at objectivity towards scholarship. But I'll just leave that there. One significant Global South scholar of the early 2000s who has theorized on decolonial feminism began with the idea of the coloniality of gender. This is Argentinian feminist philosopher, activist, and professor of comparative literature, inseparable axis of the capitalist world system and modernity in terms of the coloniality of power and its workings. And here, Lugones says, unlike colonization, the coloniality of gender is still with us. It is what lies at the intersection of gender, class, race, as central constructs of the capitalist world system of power. Thinking about the coloniality of gender enables us to think of historical beings only one-sidedly understood as oppressed. I suggest that we focus on the beings who resist the coloniality of gender from the colonial difference. Gender does not travel away. Resistance to the coloniality of gender is thus historically complex. The coloniality of gender enables me to understand the oppressive imposition as a complex interaction of economic, racializing, and gendering systems in which every person in the colonial encounter can be found as a live, historical, fully described being. Here, Lugones points out colonial mechanisms of oppression in power relations, while pointing out modes of agency and challenging the same. Identifying the coloniality of gender, then, is a necessary part of our scholarship, as Lugones thinks. It is against this backdrop that Lugones then moves toward a decolonial feminism in terms of the relation between resistance or resistant response to the coloniality of gender and decoloniality being set up here rather than being answered. And coloniality, Lugones goes to some effort to define such resistance when she says one does not resist the coloniality of gender alone. One resists it from within, a way of understanding the world and living in it that is shared and that can understand one's actions, thus providing recognition. Communities, rather than individuals, enable the doing. One does with someone else, not in individualist isolation. What modes of resistance, then, here have taken place on the part of colonized peoples? How have colonized women proffered resistance against the imposition of gender norms that are incongruent with indigenous concepts and conceptualizations of gender? While there is much more to say about the coloniality of gender, it is the idea of resistance which reverberates through Ugandan feminist legal studies scholar Sylvia Tamale's 2020 work, Decolonization and Afro-Feminism, where she states, when engendering knowledge discourse and knowledge production, feminists have to be careful not to fall into the trap of projecting African women as hapless victims of a totalizing patriarchal capitalist oppression. The fact is that women, like all oppressed groups, have agency and always engage in some form of resistance, many times with a lot of creativity. Tamale's in-depth engagement with decolonial feminism situates numerous concerns and theorizes the epistemic scope of African studies. Among them, the basics of decolonization and decolonial futures, feminists and the struggle of Africa's decolonial reconstruction, challenges to the coloniality of sex, gender, and sexuality, rethinking the African Academy. Here I would like to mention Dr. Fatou Sowe's enthusiasm for Tamale's seminal work, and this took place at a digital roundtable on decolonization and Black women's knowledge last summer in the cluster, where Dr. Sowe was one of two prominent discussants. And permit me to quote a pithy observation here from the transcript of that roundtable. I read Sylvia Tamale's book in its entirety. I had the privilege of being asked by her to blog about her book. I took notes so I could express my appreciation and admiration for this extraordinary book, which is a source for us all to deconstruct colonization and decolonization, and to show what the links and impacts for us all to deconstruct colonization and show what links and impacts were there that are still persistent. I think it is extremely important to measure this process against what we ourselves have done with decolonization. We are, after all, 60 years after independence. If today we complain about colonization, it is because we have a real problem. And I think that future generations will hold us to account for not having resolved these contradictions in which we have lived and survived, and which we should have changed by now. This would merit some reflection in our conversation, and we could ask what kinds of community are envisioned in the decolonial feminism by African feminists. How are decolonial feminist communities built and sustained? And how do communities effect resistance and move towards change? Aside from Lugonis and Tamale's work, we've got yet another recent work on decolonial feminism that merits considerable attention with its thought-provoking ideas. Françoise Vergèse's 2021 work, Decolonial Feminism, wishes to be a contribution to be the struggles and the critique of civilizational feminism. And I'm excited to have you here with us, Françoise, to consider some of these matters. Aside from critiquing coloniality and Eurocentrism, Françoise, your perspectives on decolonial feminist work entails studying how the complex of racism, sexism, ethnocentrism pervades all relations, domination, when the regimes associated with these phenomena have disappeared. You go on to delineate the connections between scholarly and activist care work in decolonial feminisms, which can function and as vision for the future. Decolonial feminisms draw on theories and practices that women have forged over time in anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial struggles, helping to expand theories of liberation and emancipation around the world. At the same time, this aspect of community does not avoid the differences in feminist positionality. It articulates modes of resistance against being erased, silenced, and edited out of history. Françoise says, writing the past and the history of racialized women has not had the same trajectory as European feminist writing because it has not followed the same process. For racialized women, it is not about filling a void, it is about finding the words to breathe life into that which has been condemned to non-existence, worlds that have been cast out of humanity. And with that, I end my contribution to this field of thought impulses here, and we could start with the conversation. The first point that perhaps we could bring in here is that conceptual tools which are implemented in decolonial feminisms, like coloniality of gender, Afro-feminism, and intersectionality, they mobilize knowledges produced by racialized women in the global South throughout history, and whereby transformative justices informs these visions. So could you please share with us how might theorizations using decolonial feminist lenses in your respective disciplines lead to modes of epistemic transformative justice? What kinds of changes have you seen in your careers? Who would like to begin?
I'll go with
Yes, please.
an example of work that my senior sister, Techua Menu, now Emerita Professor at the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana, and I did in the 90s. And she had been invited by, I think it was the Ghana Statistical Services, to make some commentary on the census and the ways in which data are collected. And we were particularly troubled by the way in which the household was composed, right? It has these, the census built into it the assumption of the nuclear family. And we know that our families are very diverse. Many of the families are not monogamous, legally so. And we were very much impressed by the work of the Nigerian feminist scholar, Felicia Ekejuba, who has this text, I wrote the title down somewhere. Anyway, it's Women-Centered Households in Rural West Africa. This is a 1995 text. And she argues that instead of measuring the household around husband, wife, and children, the household should be measured around a hearthhold, around the cooking pot. In other words, the woman and her children. Because the man might move around, especially if he has more than one wife. So, the whole notion at the time of this European construction of a family, which actually is not even accurate for Europe, but we can leave that for now, informed our responses to the statistical services about how one should start thinking about the household. And so, even though we haven't come as far as we want to, one of the questions that are asked in the census are about, where you spent the night. So this then allows different households especially if a man belongs to more than one household, it allows them to be captured separately around the woman and her children. And, we saw this as a very important contribution towards, destabilizing the notion of family. And, even the notion of housewife, we have had to keep, telling our students, and it's very informative when you, at the beginning of the semester, we teach an introduction to African Studies course at the University of Ghana that every student has to take. And there's a gender component. And you ask students, what does your mother do? What does your father do, to get into a conversation? And you will often hear, my mother is just a housewife. And then you start asking them to unpack what it is she does. And you find that apart from all the reproductive work that she does in the home, she's also doing economic activity that's bringing money onto the table and real income in other ways. So these are just some examples of the way we've tried to trouble set notions, received notions of family, of wife, of mother, of head of household, of housewife, and all of these to complicate them and to show that they are received from a European cultural setting, and they were not true, especially when you ask students, okay, well, how about your grandmother? Then they begin to think, and it's like, actually, this model, this conceptual framework doesn't fit into that. So, one example.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alors, je vais parler en français pour changer. Et un peu
I'm going to talk French to change
mettre son casque
and force
pour être
the
plus à l'aise
public.
parmi mes collègues qui sont de formidables anglophones.
I will feel more at ease.
Formidable francophone que je suis.
I stay the French francophone woman that I am, and I try to understand to this discourse. I try to answer to this presentation from Christine, because at the same time, she gives the questions, the answers, analyze, and we have to try to pick out through her speech how we can react. I think that I started at a time where women were not studying, to work on a question which is a non-question, a non-subject in a university in the 60s was a challenge. It took me many years. And I took, like the hammer, it is a way to show what the women were doing, not only in the European way, to show a woman, not only as a housewife, when you do a study in a rural surrounding, you ask the people, they are peasants, workers, and the woman housewife. Even if they are doing handcraft, if they transform oil, if they transform fish, if they grow because they have these possibilities, just the fact to deconstruct this image of just being a housewife has been something very, very important for me. It has been very important too for the student I was at that time, facing scholars, mostly men, French, but more often Senegalese, where I realized that they were a patriarchal at that time. We were not talking about feminists at that time because it was like a swear word, but it still is, but we have the possibility to define new notions in a contradictory way because we had a way of bring African women to another level. They are role producers, and at the same time, we are trapped by this reproduction role where the women are just in their own of bringing children, of giving birth. So we have those two other different positions, a scientific patriarchate, Occidental and African, and as a woman, we are here and we fight around the idea that at that time was very difficult to express and that we managed to transform in a discourse that I call feminist. You can call it Black feminism, Afro, African, feminist in Africa. It is a new way of thinking. This new way of thinking is something that I have been constructed. It took me 20 years, and I don't want to lose it. I think that in the decolonial feminism, we have those roots of the feminists to measure it, but to open it to the past of Africa and what the past in Africa has done for the woman in a good way, bad way, in a very bad way, and to construct something to define a woman in Africa, not only a woman as a mother.
Thank you. So I like our cyber selves right now. The translation devices are very, very important here. That's great. Usaina, would you like to go next?
Thank you, Professor Christian Vogt. And I want to start first by saying greetings to everybody and to the greater Bayreuth community. I'm grateful to be among the greatest, thanks to your community. It is really a historical milestone to have this transgenerational initiative, and we are forever grateful. Once upon a time, one will say, as a scholar coming from the Sahel, when I grow up, I want to be like somebody. And to have one's dream comes true by being sitting next to that one wants to be like that, like her, is really a great honor.
Merci.
Professor Fatuso, it is a great honor from Bayreuth University to create this opportunity to be in the presence of greatness, the ones who plant the seed for some Western academy to say we have a voice, and to also her sister for across generation, Professor Françoise Vergès, to be here. It is humbling. And to my sister next, Madam President, Madam President. It is a great honor, and that is only possible because we are in a great institutions which believe in Africa and African women within the continent and the diaspora. So Bayreuth University, we are grateful to you. Thank you. So the challenge you pose us, which is an invitation for a conversation, my sister Christine, is to put us into a conversation along time, to do the travel, the historical time, to look at what history has done, history of coloniality, and then to look at what the so-called post-colonial has done, and then for us to imagine futures that are created with gaps in theory. So what we call decolonial theory, since we have our great mothers in our presence, the question for me as a linguist, a theoretical linguist, operating within a department of comparative literature, also operating within African feminist and diaspora feminist trajectory, is to ask ourselves if the operating within Western centers of knowledge have not marginalized for so long the African Women's Library of the longue durée. So how do we construct the theory with gaps when the libraries in indigenous languages, in indigenous scripts, have not been taken into account because coloniality has marginalized African women, have not defined African women as site of knowledge production. So our task, if we are to imagine decolonial modernity as a privileged elite who are navigating within Western epistemologies, in the West, like I have to interrogate my privileged location. I am a feminist African Muslim coming from the Sahel, but operating in the United States. So I have to interrogate my location, right? My trajectory by doing the care work, which the decolonial feminists, like Maria Lugones, like Cynthia Winter, like Bell Hooks, like Amina Mama, like Professor Fatou, Professor Vergès, my sister, Professor Akoswa here, are asking us to do. Privilege, how do we use our privilege to fill the gaps? To go and do the question of reparation. Reparation by retrieving the African Women's Library. So for instance, my work, when I wrote the book, Engaging Modernity, Muslim Women in Post-Colonial Niger, is to self-interrogate myself first, right? To say, what happens to women's library in my own society? Women who are intellectuals, but whose work is not known because they're writing in African languages, in Ajami or in Tifinagh. Because in Amazigh, women are the transmitters of literacy. So how come when, for instance, in the Western epistemological framework, when we talk about francophone West African women, we write them in terms of deficiencies? You see? So my work as a feminist doing the care work is to do the work of reparation. And as a comparatist, translation as a reparation is to go and retrieve the women's library. The women's library are not privileging the hierarchy that was imposed in terms of hierarchy of what is knowledge system. Can knowledge system be articulated within African orality, within multiple African languages, and by African women, and being put in conversation with the written world? For instance, the wonderful work, the groundbreaking work of Jean Boyd and Nana Asmau and Beverly Mark and Sadia Omar at the University of Sokoto is to go back and retrieve the library of Nana Asmau bint Sheikh Usman Danfodio. Nana Asmau Sheikh Usman Danfodio has written in Hausa, in Fulfulde, in Tamashek, and in Arabic. But throughout the time that people in the Western epistemology, Western framework were writing about comparative literature, until much later in the 90s, in the 80s, the work of these African women who were writing before colonialism were theorizing what gender is, what sexuality is, and what does it mean to write within class, caste, and hierarchy, marginalization, power relation, knowledge system that feminists, decolonial feminists operating within Western epistemologies like Maria Lugones, like Cynthia Winter, and others. Where is that library? How is it incorporated? And also the story of the big man theorists. Where is the women's library? Whether it's in orality and indigenous script and in dialogue with what my early sisters were talking about. What is the language? When we say elles sont ménagères, are African women intellectuals, African women theorists, writing in indigenous languages, describing African women as mère ménagère, describing the African family in those terms. The work of Nana Asmau bint Sheikh Usman Danfodio becomes very important when we take the example that Professor Akosua has mentioned. She has produced, through the creative space, her poetry is really poetry in indigenous African languages written with Ajami script. How Africans have appropriated the Arabic script that comes through the encounter between Arab-Islamic in the West African context to Africanize it, but to feminize. So she has feminized the Sokoto Caliphate Library by creating a documentation of the lives of women, the ordinary women, challenging this hierarchy, the class and the caste, even though she's the daughter of Sheikh Usman Danfodio. But each woman whose biography she presented is to inscribe the critical role as citizen of the new community that is to become. What is the role? So we know the sociology of women, for instance, but of women in the Sokoto Caliphate by reading Nana Asmau's poetry, how she presents each woman and what she has contributed in commerce, in medicine, in politics, in political philosophy. So thick theory cannot happen without a comparative recuperation of women's orality, women's multilingual, multiliteracy, multi-script, African woman inscription. And they have carried it in the diaspora as well. Today, most people who are working on West African women through the transatlantic slavery are looking at what have these African women carry, moving the body and moving the mind. They are working libraries in the ship, the transatlantic ship. But they have also, we have to look at women's library in the Mediterranean, the African women. So slavery has done something in the new world that need to be rethink and do the work of recuperation. So this is how, for instance, thinking decoloniality, we have to think of decoloniality of the long history of decoloniality that has been taking place by the intellectual history of African women. And I'm sure when we go to Algeria, we go to Mauritania, we go all the way to South Africa or Uganda, who we have become as African women across our different ethnicity and race will offer a lot to the thick theory. Thank you.
Thank you. And I say amen. Yes, absolutely. Well, good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm very honored to be here among my sisters. So you ask about, I will go back to the question, epistemic transformation and transformative justice. My approach is more, from political theory, as we say, so it's much more, it's less, located. And I was always interested in the way in which slave trade and slavery deeply transformed the world, and that we still live with the afterlives of slavery, to use the idea of Hartman expression. The way in which effectively racism is still organizing, operating in the world, is systemic and structural, and what we call the North-South. But I will say that epistemic transformation, one was very important, that it's no longer possible to ignore the work of women, the theoretical work of feminists. Despite, as Fatou say, all the setback, no, that's not important, does not exist in our language, we don't say feminism is a native language, it does not matter, it's there. And queer and trans and indigenous women are speaking. So this is really, and I do think that the reaction, the incredible violent reaction of patriarchy around the world, fascists and racists, is also because of this incredible move. They are absolutely panicking. And when you panic, you become very mean. And so they are really trying to roll back all the rights. We are talking really basic social rights, right? We are not talking even deeply transformative right? We see them being attacked, and they will be attacked. They will be attacked. Yeah. So this, for me, is both effectively moving, young women today are, of course, we were there before, and we also fought, and with a lot of courage, and some of us, in fact, pay with their lives of being feminists. We should not forget that feminism has never been a nice, road, and sweet and harmonious. It's really because you're facing really enemies. You're facing enemies. Enemies is effectively neoliberalism, structural racism, imperialism. And it's an enemy who is not afraid to kill. Is not afraid to fight back and put people in prison or defame. It's really, and we see them in action. We should remember, Marielle Franco, she is killed, or even indigenous, activists being killed. And of course, all the murder everywhere. So we are facing, and this enemy fabricate vulnerability to premature death, as Rose Wilson Gilmore has said. And we see it also because there is a war, a global war against women, Black women, women of color, indigenous women. There is really a global war. Their lives are affected by climate disaster. I'm not calling it change, climate disaster. Are affected by the state of permanent war, which is not just bombing, like bomb, but it's poverty. It's like no access to public health, no access to education, no access to water, the basic, what does a human being need? Clean water and clean air. If you don't breathe, you die. So I can breathe is effectively an incredible, powerful formula, not just about police violence, but about a world which is made irrespirable and therefore, impossible for us to live in. When I read that today in the Global South, more people are dying of air pollution than of any other cause. Of any other cause. So polluting the air is, really targeting the life of people. If I don't breathe, I die. There is no. So the fact that lungs are being attacked, and now even children before being born are affected because their mothers. So they are born with respiratory disease, which make them even more vulnerable to premature death. So I see that this is what I call war. It's not, just the bombing. And also I see it, effectively the war against women. It's like against, of course, Black women, women of color, indigenous, but also against Arab women and against, we see the incredible Islamophobia in Europe and elsewhere. And this is also the, the attack on of a question like who has the right to live? Who has the right to be protected? We see that the protection is not a universal right. Look at what happened to African women and men in the Mediterranean, on the border of Europe. We saw how it was treated differently on the Belarus-Poland border last year, and this year again with the war in Ukraine, who was effectively the good refugee, and I'm not talking about the people needing refuge, versus the bad refugee, the one who will not be accessed. This is happening today. It's not in the past. This is happening right now, today. And this is what we mean by, how racism is deeply, and how justice is about attacking neoliberalism, racism, and imperialism. Imperialism, and I'm sure that all my sisters will agree, is absolutely still, extracting everything in Africa. I mean, Africa is extremely rich and is poor. It's extremely poor. I mean, except, of course, a small elite, which, but even that small elite has no power. It's totally corrupted, can, buy so many things in Switzerland and so on, but has no power, really. When the masters say, this is going to be like that, you cannot protest, because otherwise there will be a coup anyway, and you will. So this for me, the question of transformative justice and what decolonial feminism, and for me decolonization, and I agree with what I say, is, as Fanon said, a historical process. It's never finished. It will be done, perhaps, when we will be done with capitalism, racism, and imperialism. It will, so perhaps we will breathe a little. And we are doing decolonial step. We are doing decolonial act by effectively producing libraries, collecting document archive, and it's incredible in terms of production today in cinema, for instance, from Africa. It's extraordinary. In terms of art, it's absolutely extraordinary. Not just, of course, the young continent, but also the diaspora. There is also a lot of work about what is the diaspora, because there was an hegemony of the United States in terms of diaspora. And now you are looking also towards Asia, you are not just today, but in the past. For me, in the Indian Ocean, it's very important, because the Indian Ocean has always been a cultural space between Africa and Asia. Long before the Europeans arrived, long. The Europeans were late in there. So there are something that, of course, as you were saying, we could retrieve about travel diary, like pilgrim and people, and that, so they are not also determined just as slaves. They were sailors, they were, merchants, they were, So this is also challenging, of course, the Euro-centered narrative on the global history, and more work is being done. And of course, today about migration, what does it mean? But the question of migration, so they are not just victims. They transform the world where they go. But at the same time, there is a fabrication of migration that made people vulnerable. And the incredible extraction of care also. How care is an extractive industry, because the West need women to take care of the elderly and the children and everything. And as you say, you have more Filipino nurses outside of the Philippines than in the Philippines. And more effectively, all the African, working in Lebanon or elsewhere, African women. And we talk about domesticity, but there is also sex work, And so in the way how still the black non-white body is still, nourishing the white body, making the life of the white body possible by taking care, feeding, cleaning the house, offering sex work for the husband so the wife can, go doing tennis or whatever. And, so this is really an economy, really a deep economy of extraction and exhaustion. And that economy of exhaustion is really, it started with the slave trade and then with colonization in Africa, extraction both of the land, but also of the body. You exhaust the body to premature death. We know that the slave and the enslaved could, was 8 to 10 years of life on the plantation. I'm not going, like expectancy, that could not be expectancy, no longer than that. So you have to renew. And what do we see today on the African continent? Children and so on, the life is really very narrow. And that's part of the economy of exhaustion, exhausting, extracting. So for me, decolonization, one of the tasks today is really attacking that economy of exhaustion and extraction. How do we understand extraction? Not just, of course, the mining, which is, of course, what before, mining rubber, mining peanuts in Senegal and transforming, desertifying Senegal, but also today extracting everything that we need for our phone, but also still extracting the life force. Still extracting the life force. So there is really on the global scale today, and Africa is, because of its incredible wealth, being absolutely constantly extracted and exhausted. And women effectively are also, and I'm not talking as victims, but they are more, the life is more difficult because of also climate disaster. Before that, they will walk 2 kilometers to get to fetch water. Now it's, I don't know, 8 or whatever. The life is much more. So how do we attack that economy, which is an economy of depleting life? So how decolonial feminism is also about affirming the politics of life as effectively a politics of the possibility of breathing, breathing as a decolonial right, and of course, and making the world where you can breathe, breathable and also habitable, because capitalism in the world uninhabitable. And we see it also with the heat wave on the African continent right now, and the fact that how, so, there is movement. So this construction of uninhabitable place. And I'm not saying planet. There's no planetary here. Here we can breathe nonetheless, right? And there are measures to say, okay, don't go out, it's and then fine against industry, even though, it's still a lot to be done. But, and the last things I will say also, that for me, decolonial feminism is fighting against militarization. Because the military industry is an anti-feminist industry. If you have army, you have soldiers. If you have soldiers, you have rape. You have destruction, you have devastation. So how decolonial feminism can theorize a politics of peace, which is not this peace that is being talked about by men around the table, and it's just, a short interlude between two wars, right? So they suddenly agree, okay, let's have some peace for now, and then in the meantime, we're going to build more, tanks, whatever, submarine, instead of investing in education and health and everything. When I see, for instance, some African state buying weapons, like billion, and you don't even have, public health clinic and
water
and clean water. So militarization is an invisible enemy for whatever reason, because and effectively the war in Ukraine has brought, for Europe, and they remember now that what is war, but for people in the global South, war has never stopped.
Yes. Okay, we've had just like, okay, y'all, I'm just like sitting, I'm taking notes, I'm learning, right? Okay, seminar, right? I hope you're all taking notes, okay? I'm serious. These are opportunities which are worth their weight in gold, and like I said, I'm learning. With what you have just basically set out, you also brought in the question of care, right? Care work, care politics. Each of you has very, very cogently, from your own disciplinary position, basically brought in how care is being conceptualized and how care is being economized, right? How care is also attached to certain bodies and has been also intersectionally instrumentalized to shape those bodies and the readings of those bodies. So we have here, care work is being understood and articulated in the cultural, political, emotional, intellectual, anti-racist labor of racialized and gendered bodies, both in academic and non-academic contexts. And I would also, I hope I can catch that slide here because, again, this is something that I like to work with, where in 2015, Aaron Martin, Natasha Myers, and Anna Viseo said, knowing requires caring about how one knows, what and how one knows. We assert that the politics of knowledge cannot be disarticulated from a politics of care. Right? We have these elements of engagement and responsibility, right? So they say to disavow care would be to leave intact binaries that circumscribe realms of legitimate and illegitimate knowledge and the pervasive bifurcations that prioritize the rationale over the sensory and affective dimensions of knowledge. Foregrounding care and its fraught politics is then one way to stay with the trouble and to take situated knowledge seriously. I think this is something I would like to keep on bringing into the conversation. You've already brought it in. Can we sort of look at how decolonial feminism might generate modes of care and hope? When we talk about care as well, I like to also always have that shadowy dimension of hope that's in the background, that will also come to the fore. How do we as use, or rather, read decolonial feminism as generating modes of care and hope as viable frames for envisioning African futures, both for established and for early career scholars? I would like to bring the conversation to how we do this in our university spaces, right? For me, for example, all right, you might call me an advance of some level of, a scholar of some advanced years, and I'm here and I'm in the presence of pioneers like yourself who've laid out the work. We are still doing the work right now, but there are people coming after us. So can we just talk about how this sort of generates knowledge, but where knowledge can also be a place of hope and care for those who are coming after us, and of course for those who are still doing the work.
Okay. Is it okay?
Yeah, Lucena, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Professor Williams, Christine, sister. I want to give you an example, a small example of care for me in the field of knowledge production and the work of reparation to inscribe the contribution of African and Black women, no matter which planet we are on. I've given the immediate example. So in my training, often say, you are a linguist, how come you are in a critical theory? I'm like, well, it's precisely because I'm a linguist that I have to be in critical theory to inscribe Black women, African women, contribution to what is called theory and philosophizing. But the care, the hope, is when the care in the field of knowledge production is an ethical demand. It requires ethical consciousness. It is not about what title we get. It is the work of ethics to repair that which was not allowed to be. And that is still present, what Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o said, making the visible invisible. Right? So, for instance, the work of Professor Fatou Sow, by virtue of language, because it is articulated in French, we were discussing earlier with Professor Vergès, because it's articulated in a language that in the US, the English dominance shadowed, put her work in the margins, right? So it is ethical for me not to theorize without saying, by the way, there is the library of Dr. Fatou Sow. So that's how I look at the ethics of it. In my work, many senior women, for instance, I give you the example of, I wrote a social biography of a great intellectual, Malama Aïssatou Dank Chandu, who writes in Hausa, but in Ajami. Her ethnicity is not Hausa. She's Zarma Sonrai. But she went to the school Afro-Islamic school in Ajami, and Hausa was the lingua franca for that school. Throughout the time I was doing research on her, the first time I met her, she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from here." She said, "What do you want?" I heard her poem in a taxi in Niamey. And the title of the poem is called Ilmi. Ilmi meaning knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I was so struck by this secular poem, but framed within Afro-Islamic epistemology, that challenged anybody who does not want to send a child, especially the girl child, to school. In our theorizing, we consider people like Malama Aishatu Dan Chendu. We have not considered her library then. But her intervention with the democratization process has given her a place to challenge those who were reproducing a classical poem with mistake. And she thought, okay, it is my duty as an intellectual to come and tell this ulama that they're allowing in the Islamic radio program to produce a classical text with gaps and with mistakes. I have the original text. That's how she came to radio. And that's how I find her in a taxi listening to her poem. I have to have humility to understand, oh my God, my training did not allow me to understand her library. Yeah. And her philosophizing about what knowledge is by producing this poem, Ilm, that challenged elite, especially patriarchal elite, which do not deconstruct coloniality of education, to see that people like her exist and can serve society. Throughout the time I was working to produce her social biography, I went back and forth from US to Niger. There's one day, she told me, go open this curtain. Because most of the time we will meet like this at home, and then she has her Quranic school. We will meet, I will do my interview, her veranda or her salon. But she never told me she had her private library right there. One day she said, my daughter, can you take something for me? I said, oh yes, Malama. I said, what is it? She said, lift that curtain. I lift. It is a bedroom filled with books. Filled with books. And she said, okay, I see you have been coming back and forth. Now it is yours. Her private library. I never knew this woman who was born in the 1930s had a private library right there. But when she saw I was serious about really what she stands and her legacy, she thought, okay, I can inherit her library. Wow. And so what I did, because the knowledge system, that library has to have a feature, has to be shared. Today we're talking about her, right? What I did is I said, oh, it is not about me. She has given me a gift to take care, the same way she has taken care of the gift that she was received across generations. So what I did, I went to, in Niger, we have the Institute of Arabic and Ajami Manuscript. The director is a historian, Professor Mumuni. I said, I have to make you witness there is a heritage that must be preserved. You are doing digitization, producing the works of the sheikhs. I appreciate that. But there is a sheikha next to us. And her library needs to be protected. And it is a responsibility of this institution to make sure that she's counted in a way that was not counted before. And she is a decolonial feminist African woman, black woman, and women for the universe who want her knowledge to be shared. So that, to me, is the work of care. It is ethical consciousness to reveal that which was not allowed to be because of coloniality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Alors, je voudrais peut-être rajouter à ce que vient de dire Husseina
what I would like to add, it is extraordinary that we have described African women writing in Africa, and we have a few volumes about history of women in Africa, and women writing history in North Africa, in Western Sahara, South Africa. I think there are 5 volumes, and in these volumes, we give the women the way to tell this story. They are actors, but it is a history which is not mentioned in any book, encyclopedia. I know that UNESCO published in the last 20 years an encyclopedia of African history, and I was asked in the 9th volume, after 10,000 pages, I should write something about Africa, which would allow to see how women participate in making of history. I think it is very important because it was not in the 10 volumes. There are actors, as Mao is mentioned, but what they do, she writes in Arabic, but these women belong to the elite, but ordinary women, what they do in writing history is something we have to collect and reproduce. I know that they've read the history of women in Sahel. 2 friends of mine wrote this chapter. They collected these stories, but there are several levels. There is indigenous knowledge, but not only indigenous knowledge, but it's also about plants. Our cereals are transformed, fruit and agricultural products are transformed, how textiles are made, how life is created and maintained. And I think it is very important because women do the history. They are not only figures, a princess. You write about a princess. In systems which were not made for women, but women were in the pre-colonial era, and they were in a system. But I come back to our system. It is around the transmission by women. We transmit power to our sons, nephews. My brothers have more trust in women than others. And this system is very important because we talked a lot about the way of women to transfer power, but at what price? And how do we retrieve this part of history? And I think this part of history, we retrieve it, but we have to interrogate what is the body of a woman? Whom does it belong to? I heard a few phrases, and my masculine colleagues are shocked, and other colleagues say, stop, my body is mine. And this body, which is mine, is in the middle of care. Maybe I'm out of the topic, but when we talk about care, it's the way we have to help younger generations to push younger women, but I think we have to start inside the family, and we have to ask ourselves, who are we, how to decide upon our body and our personality and to serve ourselves. We can serve our humanity only if we serve ourselves by being strong, having confidence in our forces. We are able to think, to transfer knowledge, and knowledge is also science. I give the example of medicinal plants. When these plants are used, it's belongs to our culture, but it becomes, it is patented and it becomes science. And even in our field, men take it back and women say my body is mine is like an it relates to prostitution. You possess your body and you have to abide by rules imposed upon the body of women. This function, we have to discuss this function. A last example, the population. If you look at what happened in Buffalo, everybody talked about the great replacement. That means that black people arrived. Some are more black, yellow, but no green. But this big replacement, it is a replacement feared by the Western world. That's why Europe wants to be closed. These populations, now the Africans accuse the Western world. You talk about big replacement, you are afraid. You don't use resources. And if you leave more resources for the others, the planet is more habitable. And they impose the idea that Africa is full of resources. That's true, but Africa is poor. Africa has a lot of resources which you can find nowhere else. Very precious wood in Niger, uranium, and this is one of the poorest countries in the world. And when you come in, you say, but this big replacement, who is going to create it? And when I say the women do it, I say my uterus is the reason for this big replacement. Only use one word, uterus. This is an important issue. If we don't decide upon the use of our body, how and when I want, with whom I want, then it is going to be, we will remain victim. It's very important issue. We have to raise it. It is not raised in our space and universities. We talk about care. The African people have a tendency to idealize the woman, like the Christians, the Holy Virgin, the Mother of God. What does it mean? And it's also very costly because it means you are only the mother, and questions are raised. And these issues, we raise it because it is related to care. We are trapped because we have to represent this side of the African culture, have done it. It is part of my social contract, but a lot of women have this social contract. There are several issues which are interrelated at this level of the recognition of the reproduction of knowledge. I don't like this word indigenous knowledge, but it is not only knowledge, it is science. And at this level, we have to fight to remain at this level. We produce, we favor, we support ourselves at this higher level, which is academia, where it's very difficult to interact, and the other space are the spaces of human life.
Christine, can I come in? Yes, please. I want to tie some things together that my sisters here have said, and to start with issues of ethics and being human. But before that, when Usaina was talking about the Women's Archive, in her introduction of me, Christine mentioned a film that colleagues and I have worked on, and building this archive, and we've been interviewing women activists who came of age in the 70s. So most of these women are now in their 70s. One is 80. The youngest just turned 60. And the film is called When Women Speak. I mean, that should be self-explanatory. Now, one of my daughters is a member of the team, and she has been extremely irritated because every time we have shown the film, one of the first people to raise their hands to ask a question will be a man in the room. And 9 times out of 10, there will be a question about where are the fathers, what about the husbands and the brothers? And she's like, the film is called When Women Speak. And so even in this space about women, it's like, guys, can you read what this film is about? Anyway, that was just an anecdote. So thinking about care and ethics and being human, I know we all like the notion of Ubuntu. And in Akan culture, there's a saying, Benkum jare nifa. Nifansu jare benkum. So the left hand washes the right, and the right hand washes the left. And it is to underscore reciprocal relationships. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, if somebody who is materially better off than somebody else receives a gift from the person who is materially not as prosperous, you, the one who are materially better off, cannot say, oh, it's okay, you shouldn't have. Because when you do that, you express a certain arrogance that you will never need their help. And we also say, times change. You do not know what your condition will be tomorrow. And so to look at the material, whether it's the wealth that you have, whether it's the knowledge that you have, whether you're a professor in an institution, you don't know where you're going to be tomorrow. And I think in the ethics of care, in the feminist movement, we've done a good job of that, but we also need to recognize the ways in which I think in today's world, there's a tendency for us to weaponize our knowledge, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, I know better than you, and I know more than this other person. And the academy is very good at making us those kinds of people because we need to get our promotion and we want to be the most popular professor in the room and the one who is cited and gets the most hits in social media. And so there's a lot of shouting, and the louder that you can shout, and the more elegant your shouting can be, your knowledge is privileged. And you know, as my sisters have said, there's a whole lot of knowledge out there that we don't know about. The internet has made it possible for us to harvest a lot more, but look at that library you talk about. Until you make it accessible for us, we won't know what's in there. And then, you know, to dare to talk about women from Niger without, you know, making reference to that knowledge, we need to be very careful. And I make this point in relation to care, because the academy and these spaces of knowledge production are very fraught. They can be very exhausting. The work is being done on women's bodies a lot of the time. We need to be careful to support each other so that we are not, you know, putting more onto these bodies that are so fractured. COVID came, and we all know the damage that it's done to all of us as human beings, but especially to women who have borne the brunt of more of this reproductive work, who have experienced higher levels of domestic and other forms of violence during lockdowns, who have, in Ghana, for example, when we closed the borders, they were closed to everyone. When we opened the borders, we opened the international borders, so the aeroplanes could come in. But our road borders to Togo, on to Benin and Niger and Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire were still closed. Who's carrying the goods to trade that we are all going to eat? The tomatoes from Burkina Faso is the women who are bringing them to Ghana. So when you close the land borders, not only are you depriving women of their livelihoods, you are depriving us of our tomato stew that we have to eat in Ghana, and you're making it more expensive for women to produce that tomato stew, because even though they may be getting quote-unquote housekeeping money from their husbands, that money is not going to increase. And we all know that that money is a small portion of what the woman puts on the table. Now she has to find more money to buy those same tomatoes at a higher price. So we're not thinking in policy terms, you know, about this kind of care. In Ghana, we've now introduced what is called an e-levy, and that e-levy is adding a tax of 1.5% on all electronic transactions. What this may mean, this is early days yet, it started on the 1st of May. We don't know, people have said they are not going to do it, they're going to move back to cash. If women decide that as traders, they are going to move back to cash, and they are doing these long distances, the armed robbers on the roads are going to come and attack those buses, which was in decline because people are doing electronic transfers, and women are going to be under attack. There's going to be more, you know, robbery. There will be more of these rapes on the road and so on. So, I mean, we have a lot of these conversations. You know, often, yes, as feminists, we will introduce it to the space, but we want to conscientize and evangelize everybody. When you're having these conversations, put it on the table, because you know, it affects all of us. One of the women in the film, who is a lawyer, the film that I talked about, she says laws are supposed to be general neutral, but they have invariably not been favorable to women. And so we, you know, in terms of care, to really interrogate that. And the last two things that I want to say is in practicalizing the spaces that we inhabit. And perhaps women absolutely have to take the lead in this. When I was a young scholar, I'm going to talk about two examples that I experienced. One, I went to a conference in somewhere in Nairobi. It was basically a women/feminist conference, and the organizers made arrangements for childcare. I took my then two-year-old daughter along. During the day, she had childcare. During the evenings, I took care of her. And then I was one of the first fellows at the African Gender Institute when that was instituted. It changed over the years, but the year that I went, the two of us who went with young children, the children were provided, they went to school during the day, and then we were given a student to assist us over the weekends in case we wanted to work. I decided that, the children and myself and this young student, we would go shopping and sightseeing. But, this was built into the program to recognize that this is the kind of work that women do. I mean, either we would have left our children at home and not gone for the program. And, what does that mean for our careers? And it's the neoliberal, there are all these concepts that we throw out there. We live with them. That neoliberal, corporatizing, higher education space is cutting more and more of these things off. I mean, women have lamented for years, we're doing the reproductive work. How can you have a faculty meeting at 4 p.m. that will close at 7 p.m. when at the same time you're expected to be at home? Why, you're a bad mother, you didn't pick your children, or what is your husband going to eat, and all of that kind of thing. And yet the higher academy space has not changed very much. We're still asking for these things. In places where there are gender centers, some of these policies have changed. And fortunately or unfortunately, we still need to be the ones doing that kind of care work. I know you wanted to, to also talk about, it's like race work. Race women are doing a lot of that care. If you are in the diaspora, you are the only black person in the faculty, the black students are going to come to you. Yeah. And it's a lot of work, but it is also a privilege. And in as much as we get tired of, being the ones to do that kind of work, I think we are not yet in the moment where we can say, you know what, but it means also regenerating ourselves in the younger generation, creating those spaces for them so that they can continue the care work and do it with grace. I mean, we are so all exhausted in our souls and in our spirits with, the bombardment of the climate, the extractive industries, the kinds of things that are being done. We can talk about policy changes in the US and women's bodies and what. We're exhausted and we're often very much in pain. And it means recognizing each other's pain and the places that we are hurting. I think that it was Bell Hooks who said something about, we have to mourn together. We have to recognize our communal pain, mourn together, work together towards healing, and extend grace towards each other, because we're going to make mistakes. We're going to step on toes. We're going to sometimes be hurtful, but we should be the ones, we shouldn't be the ones to reinforce that. Yeah. We should be the ones to hold each other and to lift each other up so that we can look at the next generation, and be proud. I can see my student now heading a center that I was the first director of, 20 years ago. And she's doing a more amazing job than myself and my successors. And then you're like, wow, you planted a seed. And so I see that as important in the care work that we should be doing.
Thank you.
Well, coming after all this, so, I will go back to the question of ethical demand. I think it's very important, the question of naming also, and naming effectively those before, but naming also among ourselves, because we know the politic of citation is extremely important, and the fact that so how we pay attention when we write to effectively make reference even to people who are not known, so we don't align, like list all the men, and so then it legitimates us. But so if we, of course, make reference to less known people, it's as if we are not, so how to make that absolutely a constant, principle. Yes, I will make reference. So that's, you know, I think it's really fundamental. So it's naming effectively those who have been, you know, made invisible, but also naming ourselves, you know. And as we were saying, also talking about the, you know, the French-speaking versus the English-speaking. So therefore, for instance, in the English-speaking, suddenly, you know, there will be a discovery of something which has been like 15 years ago already being, you know, studied and written on in French. Right. If we just take these two languages, you know, okay. So, and effectively, academy is totally patriarchal and hierarchical and sexist, and even more so with effectively the privatization of university, and we do know. But I want just for me to go back to what you say, how to generate mode of care and hope, you know, in learning and teaching. And so what is learning and what is teaching, right? Well, what do we teach and how do we teach? And how do we effectively make it's okay not to know? It's okay. You don't have to prove that you can quote with that. No, it's okay. Even it's better if you arrive but not knowing. And by being ready to unlearn what you learned. Because this is also the, you know, like remember Fanon said that, you know, the best way that for colonial is to make the oppressed become the agent of their own oppression. So we arrive at the university, we come from school, we come from the society, and we are full of, you know, like wrong things. So how do we accept to unlearn so that we can learn, right? And so we say, okay, it's okay. No, you don't need to prove to me, just, you know, be sincere, I think really. And so how do we free ourselves of our own? It's not just outside there, you know, but our own things. And just a little episode, you know, I'm totally fascinated by, you know, textile and weaving. And in a summer school in Thailand, we had to choose what we wanted to do for a day, wood carving, silver carving, or weaving. Anyway, so I picked up weaving, and I went with a student. So the student learned to weave. And there was also for us, I was with a friend of mine, 2 faculty, we also could learn weaving. So I was given to the master weaver, the master weaver was going to teach me. And I started, and I could not understand anything. I mean, the thread was breaking and so on. And she did not speak English or Thai, whatever. And so she was slapping my hand like that. Like, stupid girl, you know, don't get it. Of course, you know, I didn't get it, right? So she was like, and so, of course, I become humiliated, like, you know, like after Françoise, it's that. So I say, no, I don't need to learn. You know, it's okay, I don't need to learn. And I went. And then I sat and I said to myself, you write about decolonial and so on. And here you are pouting like a little girl just because you can't, you know, learn something. So I came back and she looked at me and she said, okay, so I was a little like that, you know. But my point is, when I stopped to calculate what she was doing, when I stopped to put my intellect and say, okay, now she put her finger here, now she put her finger here, and I trust my finger, and I look at the way she was dancing, and I practically closed my eyes, you know, so to stop to effectively, I got it. I was so proud. My point is like senses also should be brought back in teaching and learning. Because otherwise it's just about reading book, you know, so that the absolute, you know, like, and reading the text and so on. So there is no more, the body are constricted, right? We learn to sit quietly, thank you very much, you know, and listen to people for hours. And of course, as soon as you move like that, the teacher say, we learn that since we enter. You know, like little school. So there is a connection made between learning and your body being like that, right? No noise, you know, and whatever. So how do we introduce the senses in the classroom and in teaching? Because if we talk about hope, hope is not just about reading a text. Oh my God, this is possible. This is possible. I can contest that, right? This is possible. So hope is a possibility, right? And that, yes, it is possible. One day, we will be free, right? And this is that, so one day. And so this is really bring back also, for me, generating, you know, more, it's like bringing back desire and joy. Please, you know. Sometimes it's like so serious, you know, it's like, oh God, you know, like please, you know, like calm down, you know, right now. We are just learning. And what do we learn? We learn to be free. We are learning, we had to be learning courage. We have the students have to leave our classroom full of strength and courage for themselves, you know. So they have to know that, yes, you can change the world. Trust yourself, you can change it. The world is not, you know, the social world is not the Earth around the moon, or the moon around the Earth, sorry, you know, or around the sun. It's socially made. So we can undo it. The room we are in was, you know, conceived by an architect and built by people whom we don't even know, you know, workers, and it's cleaned every morning by a woman whom, you know, we don't even know her name. And we enter that space as if was natural. It was made for us to effectively have this conversation. But how do we reintegrate effectively that space in its, you know, history and materiality in the way we are talking and teaching? So, you know, how effectively we bring in that in teaching, how teaching is weaving, you know, we could say, and learning. And effectively, we have to learn, and we have to make so people read, not only when we say philosophy, it's also oral, quote unquote, I don't like that word, or vernacular, or whatever, but we don't know how to say it. But effectively, the fact that everyone in every culture has thought about the world,
yes, of course,
about what is birth, what is death, what is life, what is good living. And that is philosophy.
Exactly.
You know, it's not a... And so how do we think that? And how, for instance, a very important notion like freedom and liberty was effectively first conceived by the people who fought against, you know, slavery, slave trade, and colonialism. Even if they did not write, if this woman did not write books,
yes,
they have a theory of freedom. And that theory of freedom is extremely important. So for me, it's also, how do you bring back this kind of theory in the classroom? And you don't make, you know, a hierarchy about what has been written and is, you know, the great library of great men, but also effectively how, for instance, women, you know that I wrote a lot about who cleans the world, you know, who taking care from the cleaning, not just the nurse, whatever, but all the women, but the cleaning. Because as I said, any society will not function without this daily, every morning cleaning. We will not enter hospital, classroom, restaurant, university, shops, whatever, without these cleaning things. So how do we take that cleaning effectively as a theory? Not just it should be better, they should be paid better, that's the minimum, right? That's justice. But effectively, how do we reintegrate this as a political question so we can imagine the world that where cleaning will be effectively something that we need, that any society needs, but it will not effectively put on the back of black and brown women. And then, so sometimes once in a while we say, oh, you did an essential work, you know, like you're doing the pandemic, and we applaud them, right? Yes. And then the following day, it's like that. So how do we reintroduce that? My point is like, how do we teach that the world around is absolutely incredibly cruel and brutal and full of hope. And full of hope. That every morning, everywhere in the world, people are standing up and fighting. This has never stopped. So how do we say yes? You know, because the system constructs a powerlessness. Yeah, feeling that, what can you do? It's too much. Where do you start? It's too much. I mean, I'm reading the newspaper, it's like, oh my God, I go home, you know. And But so how do we effectively hope is reintroduced in the classroom every day, you know? And as you were saying, also the question of mental suffering, how this is incredible produce, you know, like incredibly produce. So many people are not doing well. Yeah. It was reinforced by the pandemic, but also because the life is miserable, you know, it's like it's not, you know, like what are we offered? Consumption. Well, you know, after buying your third bag, you know, like not feel your life really, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Not feeling. So I will say love, you know, is part of the care, politics of care, loving each other, and effectively, you know, building collectives.
That's
Never being alone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never.
Absolutely.
Isolation is the killer. And the system produced that because it produced also competition among us, as you were saying, right? You know, that of course, you know, that these things. So how do we effectively have also the incredible, you know, solidarity always, and then we don't make judgment. For me, for instance, the feminist struggle is like, you know, cleaning women, you know, striking. They don't need to have a theory about decolonial whatever. What they are doing is decolonial struggle. And absolutely fundamental decolonial struggle. So love, joy, desire, and hope.
absolutely. My dears, I don't know about you, but we just had a master class, right? We have just had uncovered before us, live in living color, the nuances of how we can go about doing decolonial scholarship and developing decolonial visions, and of course, community. Nobody has to do this alone. This is just the beginning. It is 12. We have to work in a time-conscious fashion, right? We also have to look after our bodily needs, and there are things also coming up for us for the rest of the day. I'm not going to say goodbye. I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to say this is a moment of gratitude. This is a moment of the beginnings and the fact that we can build visions. Before I get all emotional and embarrass myself, I'm just going to say one more time. Can I please hear it for the African feminists in the house? In the house. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now, my sisters, my mothers, I would say, we have a little something for you so that you can remember today, carry it with you as well. We have our young team bringing up a few, well, a little bit of freshness and a little bit of beauty for you.
Wow.
Merci beaucoup, merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much. They are going on the airplane with me.
Thank you.
There is beauty in knowledge, no? Fantastic.
This is care.
May I also please extend my sincere gratitude to my team. I want to thank Ms. Liane Wysotsky, Ms. Lisa Nagel, Ms. Stephanie Yassert, and we also have a couple of more young ladies. Yes, there we are. We've got Ms. Linda Bessie-Giroa and Ms. Marie Tsogo, all of them part of the team who made this possible. And of course, we could not have done this. We could not have done this without all of you. Thank you for being here, for bringing good things, for bringing good wives, and also for getting good things, I hope. So, in the spirit of hope, in the spirit of decolonial love, and in the spirit of a community, please let us carry on into the world, and please continue those conversations. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That we're sitting flowers on stage. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci.
And I would like to say to Rudiger, mais je peux te dire quelque chose? Quand j'entrais à l'université, tu venais de naître.
When I go to the university, I
en noir et
just
blanc.
pictures in black and white, but I have some 20 years ago in black. I'm with my twin sister. I can't say who is who. I just see the eyes shining and the rest is black. But in that time, we made progress. Thank you.
I didn't know that.
Je n'étais pas au...
Thank you. Thank you. This is beautiful.